All right, hello, ethicists. Today we get to our first big moral theory, which is utilitarianism. A long 8 syllables, but I trust that you can handle it. So utilitarianism will be the subject of our lecture today. I'll be talking in this lecture about chapter 7. So I'm going to be introducing some of the principal figures that we'll encounter in this chapter, some of the main ideas of utilitarianism, and then we'll be going through the 3 examples the chapter goes through, the 3 sort of case studies from a utilitarian perspective that the chapter does, and then you'll get a few quiz questions at the end. All right, so utilitarianism, here we go. So the 5 figures we're introduced to in this chapter. We meet Jeremy Bentham, so over here on the left-hand side, the founding father of utilitarianism, and James Mill and his son, John Stuart Mill, a great popularizer of utilitarianism. We see some arguments from Henry Sidgwick later on, a lot in chapter 8. And then we are also introduced, I believe, in the chapter, or if we're not, then let me introduce you to Peter Singer, a contemporary utilitarian. So this movement spans back to the late 1700s and continues today with one of the most famous contemporary philosophers, Peter Singer, being a fine representative of utilitarian moral theory. All right, but we're not so concerned with who thought what. We're concerned with what was thought and should we think it, right? So let's jump into the main ideas. So the first thing that we need to get straight about utilitarianism is the morality of an action, according to utilitarians, depends solely on the consequences of the action. So note some key things that on which the morality of an action does not depend. It does not depend on what God might command in a particular situation. It doesn't depend on intrinsic features of the action. It doesn't depend on whether the person is enacting some sort of virtue or not. What matters is what happens as a result of the action. So strictly the consequences. So let me read the definition of act consequentialism. So since utilitarianism is a theory in which the morality of an action depends only on the consequences, it's a species of a larger view called consequentialism. So act consequentialism is a branch off consequentialism, and utilitarianism usually a branch off act consequentialism. So let me read that definition. Act consequentialism is the claim that an act is morally right if, and only if, that act maximizes the good. That is, if and only if the total amount of good for all minus the total amount of bad for all is greater than this net amount for any incompatible act available to the agent on that occasion. So there's some complex language in there. We'll try to break it down throughout these first few slides. But basically, consequentialists are concerned with, they say an act is good if and only if the action maximizes the good, right? So they're concerned with maximizing this particular quality that of the good, and if somebody is choosing between a variety of actions, the one that an act consequentialist would say they should do is the one that leads to the best consequences for all, right? And we'll get into that a little bit more. First of all, one thing we have to get into is what consequences matter. So not just immediate consequences, but consequences from now until the end of time are considered. So if your action has immediate consequences, those need to be considered. They need to be weighed in with consequences, more further-reaching consequences of an action. And whichever action has the best consequences all times considered will be the one that's the one that an agent should do. So utilitarianism is a species of consequentialism, and the consequences are the only things that are morally relevant, not any intrinsic features of an action or what a particular being said about it or whether it's virtuous or not. Just the consequences, and consequences not just short-term but also long-term. All right, so what kind of consequences matter? An action's consequences matter only insofar as they involve the greater happiness or lesser happiness of individuals. So an action's consequences are only good or bad if they're good or bad for beings that can become happier or less happier because of them. So something that might be helpful here, if an environmentalist might be environmentalist for different reasons, or different kinds of environmentalists. Somebody might think that an action that has bad consequences for the earth is necessarily bad. But a utilitarian would say, well, an action which has bad consequences for the earth, that's only bad if that has some payoff or that has some effect on people, right? Or beings, I should say, beings which can be happier or less happy because of that effect on the earth. So what matters are consequences for beings that can get happier or less happy because of those consequences. But now we should note this concept of happiness is pretty broad. So how do utilitarians define happiness? That will also be important. So utilitarians offer what we might call a reductive definition of happiness. They reduce the concept of happiness down to a simpler concept, pleasure, and the absence of pain. So if somebody's feeling happy and they're not feeling pain, then they meet the criteria for utilitarian happiness. Now, a couple notes here. First, pleasure is not just physical pleasure, and neither pain is just physical pain. These are broader concepts than just physical pleasure and pain. They include what we might call mental joy or mental anguish. So pleasure and pain broadly defined here. So if you're feeling joyful and also feeling physical pleasure, then you are completely happy according to this utilitarian definition, right? If you're the opposite, if you're feeling mental anguish and feeling physical pain, you are definitely meeting the criteria for unhappiness. All right, so in defining happiness as pleasure and pain, reducing this broad concept of happiness down to the simpler concepts of pleasure and pain, utilitarians are hedonists, so they're ethical hedonists. Ethical hedonists claim that only pleasure has worth or value, and only pain or displeasure has disvalue or the opposite of worth. So happiness is defined as pleasure in the absence of pain, and it turns out that pleasure is the only thing that has intrinsic worth. So the only thing for utilitarians that's valuable in itself. Everything else has merely extrinsic value for hedonists, for classical utilitarians. So let's think about some things that have intrinsic worth. So for utilitarians, only pleasure, and things which clearly have extrinsic worth. So something like money would be something that clearly has only extrinsic worth, right? So Scrooge McDuck hoards all his wealth and takes a swim in it, but the money itself, is only valuable for things, right? So it's not valuable in itself, it's only valuable for the things it can buy you, right? So that's extrinsic worth. Whereas the utilitarians say pleasure is the only thing that has intrinsic worth. So for a utilitarian, anything that has value, that value could ultimately be traced back to the pleasure that somebody's getting out of that thing. So think again about wealth. Why is wealth a good thing for people? So wealth might be good because it can buy you things that can make you happy, which ultimately might make you feel more pleasure and make you feel more comfortable, so less likely to feel pain. Now, that's not to say that wealth is the only thing that's valuable or even that it's necessarily valuable. Just if it's valuable, it's because of the pleasure it would bring and the pain it would prevent, right? So in other words, the happiness, if it were to bring you happiness, then the happiness that it would bring you. All right, so another main idea here, and then we'll get to summing it up. So whose pleasure and pain counts when we're summing up all the pleasure and pain that our actions might produce? Utilitarians say this: in the assessment of consequences, each individual's happiness gets equal consideration. So in other words, we need to be strictly, or when calculating whether an action is morally right or wrong, we need to be strictly impartial in regards to one being's happiness versus another being's happiness. So equal consideration is here defined. In determining moral rightness, benefits to one person matter just as much as similar benefits to any other person. Or to sum that up, everybody who counts, so everything that can feel pleasure and pain, counts equally, right? So all who count equally in our calculations. All right, so that's a lot of main ideas here, but let's see if we can sum this up in sort of a slogan. The book sums it up basically like this. I add on a little bit. An action is right if it produces the greatest overall balance of happiness over unhappiness, all beings considered equally. So utilitarians are looking to maximize happiness in the world. And on the face of it, that seems like a really good idea. It would be really weird if you asked somebody, hey, don't you think it would be good if the world was as happy as it could be? And they said, no, I wouldn't want that state, right? That would seem a very weird answer for somebody to give. So it seems like a good fundamental idea here, that we should be trying to maximize happiness in the world, and that everybody who can feel happiness, we should consider their happiness. And if we're looking to maximize it, then we shouldn't give preference to one individual's happiness over another, because the quality that we're looking to maximize is happiness. So whatever individual the happiness comes in, we should be strictly indifferent if we're looking to maximize happiness, make the world as happy a place as possible. All right, so if an action fails to do this, then it would be immoral, right? So it would be the wrong thing to do. So if it's the one that maximizes happiness, all beings considered equally, it's the right one. If it fails to do that, then it's the wrong one. So let's talk a little bit about moral arguments generally, and then how utilitarian moral arguments work in particular. So the general form of moral arguments is this. Action A, so whatever action we're talking about, has some feature F. And then the second premise will say it's morally good or bad to do actions that have feature F. So depending on what that feature is, the premise will say it's good or bad to do those actions. That would be the moral principle. Statement 1 would be the alleged matter of fact, right? So we get a principle in 2 here, matter of fact in 1. So action A has some feature, and it's either morally good or bad to do actions with that feature. Therefore, some person should or should not do A, depending on whether or not doing actions with that feature is morally good or not. And let's look at how utilitarian arguments are a little bit more specific. So the statement of fact here, or the alleged statement of fact, action A will lead to the greatest balance of pleasure over pain, or it won't. If it does, it will be the morally good thing to do. If it doesn't, it's the morally bad thing to do. And that we get from premise 2 here. It's morally good to do actions that will lead to the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. And it's morally wrong. It's bad to do actions that won't lead to the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. So depending on how that works out, you either should or should not do it. If it leads to the greatest balance, you should. If it doesn't, you shouldn't. So for utilitarians, where do the arguments happen? The arguments would happen trying to figure out which action of a competing set of actions would be the one that would lead to the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. Because once you've decided that, then you know from utilitarian, if you're a utilitarian, that that's the right thing to do, right? Think back to the trolley argument. So when it comes to pulling the lever, all other things being equal, utilitarians would say you should pull the lever. Why? Because one death is probably less bad than 5 deaths, especially when it comes to the happiness of the people around them, right? When it comes to pushing the fat man, the only thing that are relevant are consequences, right? So in the lever case, it was 5 versus 1. You should do the thing that kills only one person instead of 5. When it comes to the fat man trolley case, you should do the thing which results in 1 death instead of 5, right? So in that case, pushing the fat man would lead to the greatest balance of pleasure over pain of the available alternatives, of which there are only 2. And it's morally good to do actions which will lead to the greatest balance of pleasure over pain, so that would be the action that you should perform, given the parameters of that thought experiment. All right, so let's look at an example, and let's talk a little bit about quantifying happiness, quantifying pleasure and pain, because you might be feeling a little bit uncomfortable with this. In fact, John Stuart Mill, a utilitarian, was really concerned with trying to make ethics like a science, to try to make progress in ethics. And he thought we needed to come to an agreement on a first principle, so the greatest happiness principle, he calls it, and then we could make some progress in ethics like other sciences. But let's talk about the idea that seems inherent in sciences, which is quantifying, right? Which might be an uncomfortable fit in ethics. So you've probably seen this before. This is a pain measurement scale, and it goes from 0 to 10. You see this if you're like me, you injure your shoulder or injure your knee doing your hobby, and you go to the hospital and they ask you how much does it hurt, and they hand you this chart, and presumably what you're supposed to do is look at the chart, look at the faces on the chart, consider what your own face must look like, maybe look in a mirror, ask yourself hard questions like, is my face yellow and smiling, or is it orange and sort of neutral looking, or is it red and am I weeping? And then you need to try to quantify your pain, right? So put a number to it. If you're not hurting, if you're sort of neutral, then that's a 0. If you're hurting and it's, getting to you a bit, then somewhere like a 5 or a 6. And if it's the worst pain imaginable, then that's a 10 on this pain scale. And this can be useful for different kinds of treatment programs, especially if you're rehabbing an injury. They want to know how much pain, how much discomfort you're feeling, right? And quantifying the pain might be useful for various purposes there. But now, for the sake of this example, before I get for the sake of this example, this will be messy work, right? We can't, even when we're talking about ourselves, quantifying our own pain will be inexact. But even ballparking it can be useful. So now for the sake of this example, imagine the scale goes in both directions. So in one direction is pain, but imagine it's the negative, right? So imagine a number line that goes from negative on the left-hand side to positive on the right-hand side. And the negative numbers are amounts of pain, right? So -1 being like, stubbing your toe a little bit, with -10 being the worst pain imaginable. 1 being a little bit of pleasure, and 10 being the most rapturous pleasure and mental joy imaginable, right? So imagine the scale goes both ways. And then imagine we were considering an action, which action we should perform among 5 actions that we could perform in some situation, right? And imagine we were trying to figure out what action the utilitarian would recommend that we perform. So let's look at this. Imagine you're deciding which of these 5 actions to perform down the left-hand side here. So actions 1 through 5. And you think about the consequences that this action will have on 5 different people, with person 1 being yourself. And you try to predict the consequences that your action will have. So action 1 will have pretty good consequences for all 5 people. There will be a 3-unit bump in happiness for person 1, so that's you. Person 2, 3, 4, and 5 will all have a little bit of bump in happiness. Action 2 will cause you, significant amount of pain, but persons 2 through 5 will have a little bit of benefit, 1 unit of happiness. Action 3 will give you person 3, 4, and 5 a significant boost in happiness, so 7 units, while providing person 2 the worst pain imaginable. Action 4 is sort of a mixed bag. You get some joy out of it, so does person 4, with the others feeling a little bit of pain. And action 5 actually produces for you the highest amount of happiness, so 8 units of happiness, with person 2 and 4 significant amounts of pain, 5 a little bit of pain, 4 a little bit of pleasure. So then the question is, which action is the right utilitarian action to perform, and what procedure do we need to go through to determine that that's the right action? So try to answer that for yourself. So hopefully the answer that you came to was action 3. Action 3 is the action that utilitarians would recommend, and now we need to answer, well, why would they recommend it? So they would recommend action 3 above the others because it's the one that maximizes happiness and considers all people equally. So how do we figure that out? What procedure do we go through? Well, the procedure we go through is we just take each action and add the columns for each action, and then whichever action leads to the highest sum total of happiness minus unhappiness, that's the one. So you might have been tempted to think action 1. Well, action 1 leads to equal amounts of happiness for person 1 through 5. But note, that only leads to 15 units total. And there's no principle in utilitarianism that says we need to produce equal amounts of happiness for everyone. It doesn't say that. It just says we need to consider each person equally. Now, what does that mean? It means each person's pleasure and pain, whatever they might experience, goes into the calculation without a multiplier or a divisor. So just because person 1 has a high social status, that doesn't mean that their happiness gets counted any more so than person 2, 3, 4, or 5, right? They don't get a ×2 multiplier just because of their high social status. So action 1 produces 15 units of happiness. Action 2 produces -1, so it's not an action that you should do. Even though it's self-sacrificing and benefits other people, the sum total is negative, and you count in this equation. How much do you count? Just as much as the other people, right? So we need to be strictly impartial when it comes to our happiness, other people's happiness. If what we're looking to do is make the world the happiest place possible, then we should be strictly indifferent when it comes to our happiness or other people's happiness. So action 3. Action 3, we get 4, 7, so we get 28 units of happiness there. and then we subtract the unhappiness of person 2. So this will give us a sum total of 18, and that's higher than any of the alternatives. So 18 units of happiness. Action 3 is the one we want to do if we're committed utilitarians and we want to maximize happiness in the world. Action 4, sort of a mixed bag, leads to a very negative overall total. And note Action 5. Action 5 is of interest because it leads to person 1 being the happiest out of all 5 actions. You can just look at the person 1 column there. But because of the unhappiness of person 2 and 4 and 7, that happiness, even though this action might make you the happiest, according to utilitarians, it's not the one that you should do because your happiness goes into the equation just as much as everybody else's. So action 3, again, would be the one that utilitarians would say that's the morally good action. All right, so now we'll turn back to Rachel's chapter 7, and we'll look at a few case studies using these utilitarian principles and try to figure out what the right thing to do according to the utilitarians would be. So the first case is euthanasia, and the text considers the case of Freud. So I'll read just a little bit. Sigmund Freud, the legendary psychologist, was diagnosed with oral cancer after a lifetime of cigar smoking. During his final years, Freud's health went up and down, but in early 1939, a large swelling formed in the back of his mouth, and he would have no more good days. That phrase is important. Freud's cancer was active and inoperable, and he was also suffering from heart failure. As his bones decayed, they cast off a foul smell, driving away even his favorite dog. Mosquito netting had to be draped over his bed to keep flies away. On September 21st, at the age of 83, Freud took his friend and personal physician, Max Schur, by the hand and said, "My dear Schur, you certainly remember our first talk. You promised me then not to forsake me when my time comes. Now it's nothing but torture and makes no sense anymore." 40 years earlier, Freud had written, "What has the individual come to if one no longer dares to disclose that it is this or that man's turn to die?" Dr. Schur said he understood Freud's request. He injected Freud with a drug in order to end his life. He soon felt relief, Dr. Schur wrote, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, and then died. So the question we'll be looking at there is, was euthanizing Freud, was Schur's euthanizing Freud at Freud's request, the morally right thing to do? And for utilitarians, recall that that question reduces down to, is that the action that maximizes among the alternatives, so either euthanizing him or not euthanizing him, is that the one that maximizes happiness in the world? Now, it's a little bit weird to talk about killing somebody as maximizing happiness, but when Freud is experiencing somewhere negative on all these scales, right, and would have no more good days, then removing the negative would be a good thing in terms of overall happiness, right? So let's look at this case. So the traditional view of whether this action was right or wrong is that the intentional killing of innocent people is always wrong. And Freud here, I guess we would consider an innocent person. So sure, killing Freud here, Freud was certainly not deserving of being killed, maybe. And he was intentionally killed by Schur, of course, at Freud's request. So the traditional view, that is the received view from the dominant tradition here, would be the Christian view, that intentional killing of an innocent person is always wrong. But the utilitarian analysis goes a different way. So we have to ask ourselves, which action would produce the greatest balance of happiness over unhappiness? So we need to1consider how this action will affect, well, interestingly, not just Freud himself, but also everyone around him and everything around him that would have any reaction to it, right? So we would need to consider, first of all, and most obviously, what effect it will have on Freud. So it'll end his suffering. taking him from whatever negative he is, which is probably significantly down that negative scale. I mean, his own dog can't even hang out with him because he's so foul-smelling, rough times with throat cancer. So takes his negative, turns it into a zero. So when he dies, assuming that death is annihilation, he goes from a negative to a zero, which is a net positive effect on overall happiness. But then we also have to think of the people around him. So we have to think, again, most obviously about the doctor. Sure, he seems pretty convinced that this was the right thing to do and relieved that his friend is getting this relief at the end of his life, won't have to deal with the prolonged suffering. But there are some more people we would need to consider here. We'd need to consider, in fact, everybody who had a reaction to this, and consider the alternative, Freud living on, and what their reaction would be to those two cases, right? So on the face of it, it seems like this would be the right utilitarian thing to do. Freud's negative goes to a zero. Sure, gets some relief from Freud not seeing his friend in pain, prolonged pain. Presumably Freud's family would be happy to not see him in presumed pain. But then, interestingly, we would also have to consider how other people feel who might not even be like directly involved, but might just have a very strong opinion. So interestingly, if there were enough people who felt that this was morally outrageous and were really disturbed by it, then that might tip the scales the other way. Because note, there's nothing in utilitarianism that says for the feelings, for the happiness or unhappiness of somebody to count, it has to be justified, right? It's just all goes into the equation equally. So if there was a group of people who's super pissed off about this, then the right thing to do is suddenly for Freud to bear his pain, as long as their, outrage outweighs his unhappiness. So that's something interesting to consider. But given the people that we're introduced to here, so just really Schur and Freud, the utilitarian analysis on the face of it would say that the right thing to do is to euthanize Freud. Now, we might wonder, do we agree with the utilitarian analysis? I mean, it at least seems consistent with their principles. We'll put this question off for a bit. What about God's command? So we talked about the traditional view, the intentional killing of innocent people is always wrong. In the chapter, Jeremy Bentham has a fun quote about this. So he says, "The dictates of religion would coincide in all cases with those of utility," so those are utilitarians, "were the being who is the object of religion, so were God, universally supposed to be as benevolent, so wishing good for us, as he is supposed to be wise and powerful. But among the advocates of religion, there seem to be but few who are real believers in his benevolence. They call him benevolent in words, but they do not mean that he is so in reality." So what's this saying? This is saying, if God really wants what's best for us, and if the utilitarians are right, that the only intrinsic good is pleasure and the only intrinsic bad is pain, then God would want us to not experience this pain. He would want the pain relieved. And when we can't experience pleasure, he would want us to experience pleasure. At least that's Bentham's view. A little bit catty, his response, to be honest, but interesting point he makes about God's benevolence, alleged benevolence. Current law, we'll skip over for now. But one thing to note, we'll forget about that for now. All right, so euthanasia in general. Under the right circumstances, it seems that utilitarianism would support euthanizing people who are suffering, especially if there wasn't the possibility of them getting better and living a longer good period of their lives. And as long as there weren't a ton of people around them who would rather see them suffer, interestingly enough. So utilitarians would support euthanasia. But one thing that a few things that are pretty concerning are starting to come up. One thing that's concerning here is note that nowhere in utilitarianism is there a statement that nowhere have we talked anything about consent, right? So utilitarians are about maximizing happiness. So one interesting case to think about here is imagine Freud did not tell Schur to euthanize him, but imagine he was miserable and would have no more good days. And imagine further that he had no friends around, right, who would be outraged at this. So, and imagine Schur was debating, well, should I euthanize him? Should I kill him? Even though he didn't say he wanted to be killed. And Schur was thinking, well, he's going to be miserable for the rest of his life. It seems that the utilitarian action there, if Schur could get away with it, would be to kill Freud whether he wanted it or not, because they'd be taking a negative, bringing it up to a zero. So a little bit concerning there, but again, if our goal is to make the world a happy place, the happiest place we can, I don't know. I mean, usually that the utilitarian might say that case won't generally make, that sort of case won't really come up because people will find out about somebody being killed and be outraged. But we might press them on that thought experiment, on the thought experiment I just mentioned. And it seems they would have to say, yeah, then the right thing to do would be to kill him. But if he was miserable, I mean, maybe he's better off dead, whether he knows it or not. Some weirdness there, but hopefully it makes sense that utilitarians are certainly not in principle against euthanasia, and in many cases they would be supportive of it. So let's look at the next issue. The next issue is about marijuana legislation. So Rachel's in the article, in the chapter, makes a list of pros and cons and what he calls illusory cons as well, and then tries to weigh what would maximize happiness if we're deciding on whether or not to legalize marijuana. So the pros. First, he tries to build an argument for something we might think nobody needs to build an argument for, but the first claim that he builds an argument for is number 4 there. Marijuana is giving some people significant pleasure. So the argument he uses to build to that is 6% of Americans have used marijuana in the last month. A third of Americans have tried it. Americans spend $10 billion per year on marijuana, despite potential legal ramifications. So all this is to show that people enjoy marijuana so much that that many people, a third of Americans, 6% in the last month, are willing to risk the legal ramifications for the pleasure that it might bring them, for the pleasure it might give them, or the pain it might prevent, right, in cases of using it for medical use. So, significant pleasure, and if legalized and taxed, it would produce tax revenues between 2.4 and 6.2 billion, which we might be able to do some good with. And if legalized, it would save taxpayers 7.7 billion in enforcement costs. So net, it would produce at least $10 billion in funds that could be used for various social programs. And another pro here, if legalized, it would save offenders from suffering caused by incarceration. So remember, we need to consider the happiness on all people equally, and even those incarcerated for these drug offenses would need to be considered here. All right, so those would be the pros, and we would need to weigh them against the cons. Now, Rachel's is quick to point out that there's some illusory cons and some negatives that people think about marijuana that aren't actually the case. So the first he draws our attention to is that marijuana makes people violent. He says marijuana does not make people violent. It makes them sort of relaxed and chill. Like he said in chapter 1, we want to make sure to get our facts straight. So if there are studies that go the other way, then we would want our view to be sensitive to those studies. But he thinks that's an illusion, that it makes people violent. Marijuana is a gateway drug. There doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence supporting that. So whatever net suffering might come from harder drugs down the line, marijuana doesn't seem to lead people to use those. And it's also not highly addictive. It is slightly addictive, mildly addictive, but doesn't seem to be as addictive as certainly some other things that are legal, like cigarettes or alcohol and opioids and many things that are legal. Marijuana is much less addictive than, but it is slightly addictive. And there could be some cases of addiction where that leads to bad results. So some real cons that we need to consider. It can be slightly addictive. Long-term heavy use can cause mild cognitive damage. Heavy use can make a user unproductive. Smoking marijuana is bad for users' respiratory system. So these are all things we would need to consider in the negatives column, weigh them against the pros. Rachel's is pretty transparent here that he thinks the right thing to do on a utilitarian analysis, the thing which would maximize happiness between the two alternatives, legalizing or not legalizing marijuana, would be to legalize it because the pros seem to outweigh the cons. Many pros and cons he didn't even consider here. I mean, the suffering that it might prevent from people who have who are suffering pain as the result of a disease. And maybe he does consider that at some point in the chapter. That would go on the pro side. On the con side, if people used it and then were driving, Rachel's goes a little bit overboard, I think, in his chapter, saying that marijuana wouldn't make people bad drivers. That I don't know about that. It seems wrong, but I mean, I don't know what the evidence is. He says it'll make people more relaxed when they're driving. Maybe it would be a better alternative to driving drunk, but would people substitute one for the other? There's a lot of questions there. But given the facts he presents, I mean, we have that $10 billion. It's not very addictive. It provides pleasure. It prevents pain for people. While there are some side effects with abuse of it, just the use of it, it doesn't seem to be the case. So the utilitarian stance would seem to be, barring any further information, that we should legalize it. All right, so the last thing we'll look at. So in my experience teaching this in classrooms, these first two are relatively uncontroversial. Most people are on board with the utilitarian conclusions in these two sections. But the third one's slightly more controversial, much more controversial maybe. And that's what utilitarians have to say about the way we should treat non-human animals. So you'll see this term a lot when we're talking about ethics. Non-human animals, this is just to draw our attention to the fact that we are animals, and then what should we do, how should we treat non-human animals in our various practices in which we encounter them. So the traditional view is this: people and non-human animals are in separate moral categories. Non-human animals have no moral standing of their own, and we can treat them in any way we please. Put that way, the traditional view sounds a little harsh. The traditional view doesn't seem in line with common sense. Common sense seems to be, we have to be nice to cats and dogs, but other sorts of animals, we can do all sorts of horrible things. Common sense is a mess on this. But let's look at some things that people use to support the traditional view. They might say, God gave animals to us to use. In the text, it talks about Thomas Aquinas supporting this sort of view. Non-human animals are not rational, so they don't have the higher level cognitive abilities that humans do, and they can't use language. They can't speak. So with these criteria in mind, people try to make a distinction between the moral status of human beings and the moral status of non-human animals, saying that humans count for at least more than non-human animals, or at most that humans count and we can do whatever we please to non-human animals, that it's like a matter of preference, not a matter of morality at all. We'll look into this a little bit more further on in the class, but for now we'll take that as the traditional view. So what's the utilitarian view of the moral status of animals? Well, the utilitarian analysis goes like this. Recall that actions are good to the extent they promote pleasure and prevent pain, and bad to the extent they promote the reverse. So happiness, recall, the thing we're trying to promote in the world the most, is defined as pleasure and the absence of pain, right? Now note that non-human animals can experience pleasure and pain. So the pleasure and pain that our actions might cause non-human animals should be equally considered in our moral calculations. If what we're trying to do is maximize a certain quality in the world, and that quality can be instantiated in humans or non-humans, then we should be strictly indifferent as to which beings the pleasure and therefore the happiness is being produced in. So their view is that non-human animals deserve equal moral consideration to human beings. A fairly radical position, although it seems to be gaining in popularity. It's certainly not the traditional view. It's not the majority view right now. So what effect would this have on our current practices? So currently we do all sorts of experiments on non-human animals, from testing the safety of cosmetics and various drugs, cancer research, all sorts of Alzheimer's research. We do a lot of experiments on broken bones and rehab and things like that on non-human animals. So if animals deserve equal moral consideration, does that mean that the utilitarian stance is that we should stop experiments on non-human animals? Interestingly, no. They do not hold the view, they are not categorically against experiments on non-human animals. They just think if we're going to do an experiment, we need to weigh whatever pain might come to the non-human animal in the experiment against whatever pleasure might come for human beings, or whatever pain might be prevented in human beings. And if the experiment is one in which that pleasure or prevented pain in human beings would outweigh the suffering that would happen to the animal, then that experiment would be permitted. But all experiments are not like that, and even when considering whether experiments are ethical or not, that's not usually the calculus that goes on. The book mentions a few experiments that are worthy of note here. So, in Maryland in 1996, scientists used beagle dogs to study septic shock. They cut holes in the dogs' throats and placed E. coli infected clots into their stomachs. Within 3 weeks, most of the dogs had died. It doesn't say what results came from that, but if the results weren't impressive, didn't lead to any advancements, then certainly that would be an experiment that utilitarians would be against. Another one, in Taiwan in 1997, scientists dropped weights onto rat spines in order to study spinal injury. The researchers found that greater injuries were caused by dropping the weights from greater heights. That has to go in the Science Hall of Shame. That seems like a super intuitive conclusion that everybody knew going in. It doesn't seem like we needed to drop heavy weights on rats' backs to figure that out. So those would all be examples of experiments that shouldn't continue. If experiments do lead to impressive results, then they would be ethically justified on the utilitarian analysis. So we wouldn't just have to consider experiments, we'd also have to consider the living conditions of non-human animals who are killed for human consumption. So we'd have to consider the pain and suffering that results from factory farming practices, so producing non-human animal flesh for human consumption, And we would need to weigh the suffering that happens with those millions of animals daily, and versus the pleasure that humans get from eating their flesh. And we would need to weigh that. So versus an alternative, right? So should we continue doing that practice that results in whatever suffering and pleasure it results in for all parties considered, versus the alternative practice, which would be eating plant-based diets and whatever suffering and pleasure might result from everything surrounding that, and weigh which one would lead to the most overall happiness, so the most pleasure minus pain, right? All right, so that's the utilitarian analysis of how we should be treating non-human animals, and that's the introduction to utilitarianism for chapter 7. So now let's get to some quiz questions. So quiz question number 1. Utilitarian is a kind of A, consequentialism, B, deontology, or C, egoism. Which theory is utilitarianism a species of, or a kind of? Quiz question 2. According to utilitarianism, it is never okay to cause harm. Is that true? A or B, false? And quiz question number 3. What is the utilitarian view of the moral status of non-human animals? Is it that they deserve no moral consideration? We can treat them how we please? Then answer A. Is it that they deserve some moral consideration, but less than that of humans? That would be B. Or is it C, that they deserve moral consideration equal to the consideration we owe humans? Those will be the 3 quiz questions for this lecture. So much for an introduction to utilitarianism. Hopefully you find it useful, and we made clear the main ideas of utilitarianism and how utilitarians would treat a few different ethical issues. Next time we'll talk about chapter 8. We'll talk about the debate over utilitarianism, and that will elucidate some of the attacks that people have made against utilitarians and some of the responses utilitarians have had to those attacks. It's an interesting chapter, so thanks for tuning in. I'll see y'all in a little bit.